So, I'm back at it again with the ridiculous video topics, I guess. About a year ago, I made a video called Naruto is Just Anime Family Guy, where I basically attempted to describe the many core similarities that existed between the two series in relation to their era, influence, legacy, and impact respective to their genres. Most people were very confused, angry, or just straight up unconvinced by the video. But there were some who picked up on the points I was making and were able to see my admittedly weird vision. I honestly didn't know if I would ever make another video in that vein again, but lo and behold, the crazy ideas just keep on coming. This crazy comparison was inspired by the infuriatingly redundant debate the internet loves to get into every now and then of Aang vs. Korra or The Last Airbender vs. The Legend of Korra. The impetus of the most recent edition of this mass internet debate was the plot synopsis of the new Avatar series being released to the public. It looks like Korra done goofed around and fucked up the whole world based on her many questionable decisions from The Legend of Korra. I made another video around the same time as the Naruto is Anime Family Guy video that was called A Slight Defense of The Legend of Korra. This video was meant to serve as a rejection of the idea that just because The Legend of Korra had some big flaws, that didn't mean that it was a bad show or that it didn't have some amazing and worthwhile moments, characters, and stories to tell. I even mentioned that I didn't like how everything in the show was always compared to its predecessor because, despite being a sequel to The Last Airbender, it deserves to be treated as its own story and not just a continuation of another story. Well, here I am, painstakingly comparing the main character of that story to her predecessor for money and clout. I guess I really am a sellout. Looks like you were right, random commenter. But in all seriousness, this video is less about my personal opinions of Korra vs. Aang and more about how oddly similar I find the community dialogue around the debate to be to the classic never-ending basketball debate of LeBron James versus Michael Jordan.
I got him number 2 all time. You got people walking around like that's disrespect.
It is.
It just turns my stomach when all these blind witnesses try to delude themselves into believing that LeBron James is better than Michael Jeffrey Jordan.
I recognize that not everyone who watches my videos is a fan of basketball or even a professional sports fan as a whole. So just in case you're unaware of the epic magnitude of this sports debate, let's just say this. The LeBron James versus Michael Jordan debate has been going on for well over a decade and has shown no signs of slowing down. Men have been made millionaires from siphoning the clout and intrigue from this debate for views and clicks. But I think the funniest thing about the LeBron versus Jordan debate is that there can never really be a clear answer because Michael Jordan and LeBron James, at least as professional basketball players, existed in two completely different eras and have never and will never play against each other in their primes. In fact, Michael Jordan officially retired for good from the NBA the season right before LeBron James was drafted into the NBA. They missed each other by only a few months. That's pretty crazy when you really think about it. For the sake of the argument though, think of Aang as Michael Jordan and Korra as LeBron James, which honestly shouldn't be too hard because Aang's got MJ's iconic bald-ass head, and Korra and LeBron are both built like Cameroonian sand miners, so the similarities are already there.
That's a big bitch.
The core of both of these debates seems to boil down to nostalgia versus the future. Before Michael Jordan, professional basketball was just getting out of one of its darkest periods. The 70s were not bringing in the same influx of new fans that the 50s and 60s were, and despite having two separate leagues, the ABA, American Basketball Association, and the NBA, the National Basketball Association, eventually the owners of both realized that they had to merge the two leagues to save the game as a whole. Thankfully, the Magic Johnson and Larry Bird iconic rivalry restored the game's popularity in the early 80s. Michael Jordan was drafted in 1984 at the peak of this heated rivalry, and he would live in Bird and Magic's shadow, as well as Isaiah Thomas from the Detroit Pistons, for the entirety of the decade, being unable to beat any of them or win a single championship despite being the clear basketball prodigy that he was. Speaking of prodigies, Aang was born to be the next Avatar, and he was head and shoulders above the rest of the young monks that he grew up with in terms of bending prowess. It wasn't until his 12th birthday that he was informed by his elder monks that he was in fact the Avatar and would have to carry the burden of the entire world's pain on his shoulders. Which seems like a pretty reasonable thing for a preteen to stress out about. This stress and fear for his responsibilities caused Aang to abandon his temple and his people right before they would end up being attacked by the Fire Nation and wiped out, and he ended up having to freeze himself in the middle of the ocean where he would stay hidden for 100 years. He only learned of his people's death days after finally being awoken. While the magnitude of Jordan not being able to win a ring in the 80s and Aang being the reason his entire family and way of life was wiped off the face of the earth are not even in the same stratosphere of trauma, they do both represent the biggest failures in their respective careers. Aang could never go back and save his people the same way Jordan could never go back and beat those great teams of the 80s. The only thing that either of them could do was improve themselves and go forward. And go forward they did. Aang ended up mastering all 4 elements, including energy bending, in the span of 9 months, which is pretty much unheard of for an avatar, and he ended up defeating the Fire Lord and ending the Fire Nation's 100-year reign of terror on the world. While Michael Jordan hit the weight room and bulked up to about 220 pounds from his notoriously skinny frame in the 80s, and went on to never lose a playoff series to Bird, Magic, or Isaiah ever again. He also won an unprecedented 3 straight NBA titles from 1991 through 1993. Then he retired to play baseball for about a year and a half, only to come back and three-peat again from 96 to 98.
Hey, that's pretty good.
Both of them ended up etching their names in the history books as the greatest avatar and NBA player of all time. On the other hand, we have LeBron James, a little boy from a nowhere town called Akron, Ohio, who grew up idolizing Michael Jordan and just so happened to be 6'7" by the time he was 16. LeBron was deemed the chosen one by the media and also kinda himself, and he was looked at as the one who would replace Jordan as the greatest player in NBA history. He was so highly touted, in fact, coming out of high school, that the NBA didn't even wait for him to go to college. LeBron James was drafted by his hometown team, the Cleveland Cavaliers, in 2003 at the age of 18. Korra, much like Aang, was also born to be the next Avatar. But unlike Aang, who needed to be told that he was the Avatar when he turned 12, Korra and her family knew what she was from the time she was in diapers. Because, well, I mean, look.
I'm the Avatar! You gotta deal with it!
Fans of the Avatar series like myself watched the early episodes of Korra very similarly to how NBA fans, much like myself, watched the early years of LeBron, hoping and expecting them to live up to the hype that their GOAT predecessors had set for them. Basketball fans watched LeBron James show incredible skill, poise, and almost unbelievable athleticism that made the Jordan comparison seem true at times. But we also watched him lose over and over again in the playoffs to superior teams. Avatar fans watched Korra effortlessly bend elements and dive headfirst into fights in a way that Aang really didn't do until near the end of his show. But we also watched her get packed up in a lot of those big fights, and she made a lot of boneheaded decisions that Aang would have never made. LeBron ends up leaving the Cleveland Cavaliers after it was clear that they weren't going to win a championship as currently constructed, and he becomes somewhat of a villain for this when he teams up with 2 other stars, Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh on the Miami Heat. It's on the Heat that LeBron finally wins his first championship. 2 in fact, but he also loses 2 championships that many felt like he should have won. The first one he lost against the Dallas Mavericks, he admittedly played like shit, and another one against the San Antonio Spurs, who he did beat the year before. But yeah, they got straight up cooked the year after. This decision to change teams would end up having huge ripple effects in the culture of NBA free agency. Basically, it ended up empowering star players to take control of their own careers and force their way out of teams and situations that weren't successful in order to create super teams with other stars that would be successful. As a quick side note, a bunch of superstars teaming up in a new city wasn't invented by LeBron James. The Boston Celtics actually did it like a year or 2 before with Kevin Garnett, Ray Allen, and Paul Pierce, but people don't really care about that for whatever reason. It seems like a lot of people just like to blame LeBron for changing the culture of NBA free agency. Granted, LeBron doing it was a bigger deal, but he still didn't start the trend. But moving on to Korra, Season 1 Korra was a prodigy. She had high hopes of being the next great Avatar just like Aang. But as the story went on, it was clear that she lacked many of the strong traits that Aang had in spades. She was hard-headed and stubborn. She was impulsive. She lacked emotional stability. She often overestimated her strength, which would lead her to starting fights she probably shouldn't have. By the start of Book 2, many fans in the series were not really fans of Korra. And by the end of Book 2, she makes a decision to connect the spirit world to the human world. This decision ends up making her somewhat of a villain to the people, and it also ends up having a huge ripple effect to the world of Avatar that's apparently still being felt based on the description of the new series. Am I crazy? Are you starting to see the similarities here? Maybe you need more convincing. We can even go book for book with Korra and compare it team for team with LeBron. Book 1 Korra is basically first stint Cavs LeBron. young, promising, but ultimately falls short of great expectations. Book 2 Korra is Miami LeBron. This is where a lot of people start disliking the both of them. They both end up achieving great things in this time though. Korra defeats the Dark Avatar and becomes more in tune with the spirits, finally. LeBron wins his first 2 rings, arguably has his best seasons while on the Heat, but also loses to the Mavericks in the finals while playing like shit, which is what he still gets hate for to this day. Korra also loses the link to the past avatars and merges the spirit realm in this time. Book 3 Korra is second stint LeBron. Older, wiser, making up for the mistakes of the past while making progress in healing the world, but ultimately still suffering more L's than victories. LeBron rejoins the Cavs, finally bringing them the super team that he couldn't back in his younger years, ends up defeating the seemingly unbeatable Warriors in 2016, but loses to them in both the years after once they follow his super team formula and pick up Kevin Durant, so he ends up taking more L's than W's as well. Book 4 Korra is Lakers LeBron. Clearly not what she used to be, but still strong and resilient enough to get one more big dub and save the world, even though she couldn't really beat Kuvira and needed a lot of help. LeBron, clearly not what he used to be, but still one of the best in the league, manages to also get one more championship out of it, even though it's the literal definition and origin of Mickey. LeBron and Korra clearly have a lot of similarities both in their origin stories and in their public perception. The biggest connection, though, is how they are both fairly and unfairly compared to the one who came before. And this is where we really get into the nitty-gritty of these arguments. There's the supporting cast argument, where people mention how Jordan played with 2 Hall of Famers in their prime and an all-time great coach during his time with the Bulls, which is similar to Aang having 2 all-time great benders like Katara and Toph with a great mind like Sokka on the team as well. Meanwhile, LeBron had nobody like that in his first stint with the Cavaliers, and throughout his 20-year plus and 3-team career, he only played with 3 Hall of Fame level players in their prime: Dwayne Wade, Kyrie Irving, and Anthony Davis. This is comparable to Korra, who had Bolin, Tenzin, and Mako as her team, with Asami also being there, I guess, but not really. There's also that whole LeBron doesn't have the killer instinct like MJ debate, which is kind of similar to the Korra isn't connected to the spirits like Aang debate. And I can't forget to mention the Jordan never lost in the finals, unlike LeBron who lost 6 times debate, which is incredibly similar to the Aang beat all of his villains while Korra lost to most of her villains debate. This one in particular has always been really interesting to me because I think it's the most one-to-one to how both sides like to argue. As I said earlier in the video, Jordan could not win a ring in the 80s. He lost to Bird, he lost to Isaiah, and he never even really got a chance to lose to Magic because he couldn't even make it far enough to play him in the finals. The 1980s was a true golden era of basketball where it felt like an all-time great player was on every team. The 90s definitely had its fair share of all-time greats, but many of them were either on their way out in the early 90s or just coming into relevance in the mid to late 90s, which means that, in a lot of respects, Jordan didn't necessarily have the toughest competition in the years that he won his championships. LeBron, on the other hand, had to play the San Antonio Spurs with prime Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili, and Tony Parker, with all-time great coach Greg Popovich at the helm in his very first championship series. Then he had to play basically that same team twice in the finals years later in his career. He also had to play the prime Steph Curry Warriors 4 times in a row during his second stint with the Cleveland Cavaliers. 2 of those years, prime Kevin Durant was also on the Warriors. Basically, this was an unwinnable series for 2 years in a row for anyone. LeBron's only easy series was the pandemic series against the Heat when he was damn near 40 years old. There's a solid argument that even though LeBron lost more than Jordan in the finals, LeBron faced the much tougher competition. To compare this back to Avatar, Aang had to fight his fair share of strong enemies: Ozai, Azula, that sea serpent thing, I guess. But he never really had to go one-on-one with a number of consistently strong threats that Korra did. Korra had to fight the strongest waterbender ever in Aman, arguably the strongest earthbender ever in Kuvira, one of the strongest airbenders ever in Zahir, as he was the first airbender in 1,000 years who could just straight up fly, and oh yeah, the dark f***ing Avatar, who's really only weak to those with a strong connection to the spirit realm, and considering how spiritually weak Korra is, this is a matchup nightmare for her. Korra obviously lost more than Aang, and Aang was definitely the stronger, more capable Avatar if we're comparing wins, losses, and skill set. But it's hard to really argue that they were going up against the same level of opponents. Put Aang's villains against Korra's villains, and I feel pretty confident that Korra's villains mop the floor with them. Same thing for Jordan's finals opponents against LeBron's. Also, add in the fact that the floor for Bender's skill was much higher in Korra's time as opposed to Aang's, when things like metal bending and lightning bending were still just being discovered or just being honed and crafted, while they were commonplace and completely mastered in Korra's time. Similarly, basketball players of today and the last decade or so are so much better and more skilled than they were during Jordan's time in the 90s. That's not to say Jordan was playing a bunch of bums or plumbers, as some like to say, but skill, knowledge, and the meta of basketball has come a long way since the days of Jordan. It doesn't diminish MJ as an amazing player, just that his era of players as a collective are not as good collectively as the players of today. I think the other clear one-to-one comparison in these two debates is just how one-sided it is. Most people believe that Jordan is the GOAT, period. End of discussion. LeBron sucks and could never even come close to MJ. Eat a dick and die. That's extreme. And most people arguing with the Avatar side of this feel the same way about Aang over Korra. Again, my personal opinion isn't really important in this video, but I do always feel that the people on the Aang and Jordan side of this don't really treat the argument fairly in many cases. Aang and Jordan are talked about with this mysticism, like they were these infallible beings that never made a mistake and always won. When in reality, people give Korra shit for ending the connection to the past avatars, but Aang technically did the same thing when Azula sniped his motherfucking ass mid-form change at the end of book 2. If it wasn't for Katara and her Deus Ex Machina magical healing water, Avatar The Last Airbender would have ended right then and there. And people like to act like Jordan was this incredible winner who never lost and never faced adversity, but as stated before, it took him about 7 years to finally even get to the finals. And after he won 3, he took a break because of how exhausted he was mentally and physically to go fuck around and playing baseball for a year and a half, only to come back halfway through the 95 season and lose to the Orlando Magic in the playoffs. Yeah, he just straight up lost to fucking Nick Anderson and Shaquille O'Neal, I guess. I'm not saying these L's outweigh their successes, but it's interesting to me that Aang and Jordan defenders either don't acknowledge these shortcomings or just brush them aside while constantly highlighting LeBron and Korra's faults. Both LeBron and Korra accomplished incredible things that are on par with their predecessors, but their detractors always find ways to discredit them despite this, because unlike their predecessors, they had to face more adversity. And that's the real takeaway from this discourse to me. The internet breeds debate and conversation. It's one of its founding ideas and principles, being able to connect with people across the world and share thoughts and opinions in hopes of connecting with each other more. But unfortunately, the founding idea has led to some of the most toxic and mind-numbingly stupid debates in human history, and it's all played out in a public forum for the world to see. This video is most likely just adding fuel to this toxic fire, but hopefully it serves as more of a sobering wake-up call to everyone partaking in these unending debates to say no more. No more shitting on each other for differing opinions. No more splitting hairs between great athletes and great stories to see which one is really the best. No more attacking each other over shit that really isn't that important in the grand scheme of things. Let's just enjoy greatness while it lasts and be thankful we got to witness it. And if someone disagrees with you, let them have their opinion. Enjoy it in silence and solitude. Or just start arguing and yelling at each other in the comments of this video. Whatever floats your boat. Some people are born with the weight of great expectations on their shoulders, and the magnitude of that weight may vary from person to person, but I think we can all relate, at least in some way, to having unrealistic expectations placed upon us by others or even sometimes ourselves. When those expectations are born within the shadows of who came before us, I think it's important to always keep a strong sense of self while navigating that tricky process. When people expect you to be like your parents or your siblings or anyone else that you may be connected to, it can be easy to fall into that trope and play a role others expect you to play and end up losing whatever unique traits that you once had in yourself. But it's imperative to remember that those who came before you already gave the world what they had to offer. And as we've all seen over the years, remakes and reboots tend to not be as good as the original. So don't copy the original, but learn from their successes and their mistakes, and use that knowledge to foster your own quirks and skills to become something different and better for you, not for other people. Or in simpler terms, just do you, man. Just do you. And for my basketball and Avatar fans out there, if Aang and Korra were in the NBA, what type of players do you think they'd be? You know, I was thinking like Korra would be like a stretch four, like, you know, like a strong wing. Like, you know, she would get like at 20 to 25 a game. You know, definitely ball dominant, needs the ball in her hands. I'm thinking like 20, 25 points per game, maybe like 10 to 12 boards. Definitely low on assists. She's not going to facilitate at all. More like a Carmelo type of player, like high volume scorer. And then Aang, 100% facilitator. You got to get him on the point. He's probably the type, like, he's not a walking bucket, you know what I mean? But he can get you a bucket if you need it. I'm thinking like maybe like a more efficient, like Steve Nash, maybe like Chris Paul type. Definitely dangerous from three, 100%. I'm thinking he's like 17, 20 points per game, like 12, 14 assists, probably real scrappy on defense. Yeah, you know, let me know in the comments below. I'll talk to you in the next one.